Welcome to the House of Hypertrophy. In the muscle and strength building worlds, a good number of misconceptions exist. I would argue there are some important misunderstandings with CNS fatigue, that is, central nervous system fatigue. It is a term thrown about quite a bit. For example, you may hear someone say my CNS is fried. But are the common beliefs surrounding CNS fatigue supported by the scientific literature? Is CNS fatigue always present in the days after training? Do heavier loads always produce more CNS fatigue than lighter loads? Is the deadlift more taxing on the CNS? Does training to failure always produce more CNS fatigue? Is handgrip strength truly a valid measure of CNS fatigue? And do you always experience the same level of CNS fatigue after workouts? Let's dive in. Feeling subjectively tired is what some feel CNS fatigue is. Strictly speaking, this isn't a pinpoint accurate description of CNS fatigue. CNS fatigue refers to a specific event, and it is also quantifiable. Remember, muscles generate force thanks to the electrical signals they receive from the CNS. That's the brain and spinal cord. CNS fatigue specifically refers to a reduced electrical drive from the CNS to the muscle, which reduces the number of muscle fibers that are activated and/or the firing rates of a group of muscle fibers. In other words, the muscle cannot produce as much force. Researchers can quantify CNS fatigue in different ways, most commonly by looking at voluntary activation. Voluntary activation refers to how much of a muscle's force-producing potential a person's nervous system can access. After exercise, if voluntary activation is reduced, this means the nervous system has lost some ability to access the muscle's force-producing potential and is believed to indicate CNS fatigue is present. More details about voluntary activation can be found in the description. Nonetheless, there is another way researchers may infer CNS fatigue. CNS fatigue can reduce the force of muscles we haven't directly trained. Say you only trained your right bicep. If your left bicep has also lost some strength, this may indirectly infer CNS fatigue is present. Before moving on to the next section, it's just worth knowing CNS fatigue isn't the only thing that reduces muscle performance. Peripheral fatigue does too. Peripheral fatigue refers to changes inside of the muscle that lowers its force. Fascinatingly, some studies have failed to observe CNS fatigue days after lifting, such as these two studies which were done on trained individuals, involving a range of compound exercise performed mainly for 4 sets each with heavier loads in the 4 to 6 rep range. CNS fatigue wasn't present 24 or 48 hours after, but we do have quite a few other studies finding CNS fatigue days after lifting, such as these two studies involving training the back squat with 10 sets in the 5 to 10 rep range. They also involved trained individuals, although one of the papers involved a subset of untrained folks too. CNS fatigue was present for up to 48 to 72 hours after. Other studies involving higher volume maximal eccentric training, which is where you maximally load the lowering portion of an exercise through specialized equipment, produce CNS fatigue that persists for a few days after. Since training volume, that is set numbers, appeared to be the thing that differed the most between the data finding CNS fatigue and not, this data would suggest more volume is associated with greater CNS fatigue, something I'm sure is unsurprising to many. We've previously seen at the House of Hypertrophy that reps between 6 and 35 can be similarly effective for building muscle, provided reps are performed to or very close to failure. But it's commonly thought heavier loads generate greater CNS fatigue, but the research actually fails to support this. This study found when training dumbbell curls, there was no significant difference in the CNS fatigue produced immediately after training with either 5, 10, or 20 repetitions to or very close to failure. Two other papers find with a leg extension with reps to or very close to failure, CNS fatigue measured immediately afterward tended to be greater with a 40% load compared to an 80% load. In fact, it seems that the longer the contraction duration, the more CNS fatigue immediately produced. This study found more CNS fatigue immediately after holding a 20% strength contraction for 13 minutes compared to holding an 80% strength contraction for 30 seconds. Another study found with the hand muscle, holding a 30% strength contraction that lasted for around 400 seconds produced more CNS fatigue immediately after, compared to holding 45, 60, and 75% strength contractions that lasted for these durations. Longer duration aerobic training has also been documented to generate more CNS fatigue immediately after. Savvy viewers may be thinking, I've only presented the CNS fatigue measured immediately after the contraction, but what about in the days after training? When looking at fatigue overall, so we're not looking at CNS fatigue just yet, it seems lighter loads, and thus higher reps, are more fatiguing. The results of this study find slightly worse recovery of muscle performance as you progress from around 4 to 12 reps. Moreover, there was incrementally more damage as you progress to the higher reps. Another study finds when training a leg extension with reps to failure, recovery in the days after was slower when training with a light 30% load compared to a heavier 80% load. It does appear CNS fatigue contributes to the greater fatigue from lighter loads. This study had subjects train one of their legs with either a lighter 40% or heavier 80% load on the leg extension, separated by a week. Reps were taken to failure, and as expected, recovery was slower after training with the 40% load. Importantly, a decrease in strength of the opposite leg was seen immediately and up to 24 hours after training with the 40% load, suggesting CNS fatigue, since we know CNS fatigue can reduce the force of muscles not directly trained. When training with the 80% load, there was no decrease in the opposite leg strength. So lighter loads, and thus higher reps, produce more fatigue. But does this really matter? It depends on which angle you look at this. If you're trying to minimize neuromuscular fatigue and maximize stimulus, reps on the lower side better achieve this. But the thing is, your body can handle and adapt to fatigue. If the fatigue from reps up to 35 was counterproductive for building muscle, we'd expect it to compromise muscle growth. But the fact research finds reps up to 35 produce similar hypertrophy tells us the fatigue generated from lighter loads isn't enough to kill gains. This even holds true when the number of sets you perform is in the moderate to higher range. For example, this study from New York had trained subjects train these exercises for 3 sets each, 3 times per week for 8 weeks. This resulted in them performing around 18 weekly sets for the quads directly and 18 weekly sets for the biceps and triceps indirectly. One group trained each set to failure in the 8 to 12 rep range, while another group trained each set to failure in the 25 to 35 rep range. Ultimately, growth of the elbow flexors, triceps, and quads was similar between both groups. As we'll see later, your body has the capacity to speed up recovery. Deadlifts are said to be one of the most fatiguing exercises. Does the research support this? These researchers had 10 trained men train the deadlift and squat on different occasions for 8 sets of 2 reps with a 95% 1 rep max load. Measures of CNS fatigue were similar between both exercises 5 and 30 minutes after training. There are 2 important considerations. CNS fatigue was quantified by looking at voluntary activation of the quads. This isn't an inherent problem since we know CNS fatigue can have a systemic effect, but I think it would have been more ideal for the researchers to look at an overlapping muscle between the 2 movements, such as the glute max. Secondly, CNS fatigue was just measured 5 and 30 minutes after the session. What about in the days after? Fortunately, another paper helps us out. 12 trained men performed the deadlift, back squat, and bench press on different occasions. With each movement, they performed 4 sets of reps to failure with an 80% 1 rep max load. None of the measurements taken indicated the deadlift was more fatiguing than the other exercises. Measures of muscle swelling, stiffness, soreness, performance, and damage was quite comparable between all 3 exercises in the days after training. Now, this study didn't strictly measure CNS fatigue, but many people's assumption is the deadlift is overall more fatiguing, and this study fails to support that. Having said this, another study had 10 recreationally trained men perform these exercises, including the deadlift, for 2 sets each. Subjects repeated this exact workout 24 and 48 hours after to quantify their performance recovery. The deadlift was largely the exercise that had the lowest recovery, indicating this movement may be more fatiguing, but it was far from being substantially more fatiguing. So what do we make of all this data? Well, 2 out of 3 fail to support the notion that deadlift is more fatiguing. In my eyes, the second study is probably one of the better designed ones, since it involved quite well trained lifters and examined a range of fatigue measurements, not just one. This research is certainly surprising because it's so commonly believed the deadlift is more fatiguing. I think there could be a range of plausible reasons as to why the deadlift is perceived as being more fatiguing. Feel free to pause and read them if you like. But here's the thing, I don't believe we should fully discount the anecdotes just yet. Although the overall evidence currently fails to support the idea deadlifts are more fatiguing, 2 studies aren't super strong proof, so I think some further research should help clarify things. For now, I just thought it'd be interesting to share this current research and the possibility the deadlift might not truly be more fatiguing. Training to failure undeniably produces overall more fatigue compared to not training to failure. Multiple studies establish this. For example, a recent study found when trained individuals performed the bench press for 6 sets, recovery was slower after training to failure compared to stopping around 1 or 3 reps away from failure. It may be automatic to assume this means CNS fatigue is greater with failure training, and indeed this was my default assumption. Fascinatingly, there seems to be only one study looking at CNS fatigue from training to failure. These researchers had trained men with at least 1 year of experience perform 6 sets on the back squat using a 10 repetition maximum load. On one occasion, all sets were performed to failure, while on another occasion, they only performed 5 reps per set. Muscle damage was higher after the failure training session, but CNS fatigue, both within the training session and in the days after, was surprisingly similar between both the failure and non-failure training sessions. Thus, this data suggests the greater fatigue from training to failure may not be due to more CNS fatigue, but rather due to peripheral fatigue and associated muscle damage. Granted, this is only one study, so consider it preliminary. We shall see if future studies replicate it. Nonetheless, I would like to discuss the idea of failure training being more overall fatiguing. Does it matter? The overall literature clearly shows getting close to failure is needed to optimize the stimulus of a set. Generally, stopping around 0 to 3 reps away from failure seems to produce similar muscle growth to training to failure. I know a recent meta-regression made the rounds on social media, with some influencers saying the regression proves training to failure is superior for building muscle, but we've previously seen this regression had limitations, meaning it doesn't prove training to failure is superior. Indirect equations and estimates were used to infer how far from failure the non-failure training groups were, and these were likely not super accurate. High-quality individual studies find similar hypertrophy between training to failure and stopping around 3 to 0 reps from failure, and arguably a more controlled meta-analysis found this relationship between proximity to failure and muscle growth. Considering all this information, if the goal is to minimize fatigue while maximizing the stimulus, not training to failure better achieves this. But similar to the discussion with lower versus higher reps, the fatigue from training to failure isn't intrinsically a concern, since we know training to failure largely does not provide worse muscle growth compared to stopping 0 to 3 reps from failure. But there still are some considerations. If you're performing additional cardiovascular training and/or sprint training, preliminary data indicates muscle and strength adaptations may be better when not training to failure. Moreover, although it's not consistently established in the literature, older individuals may have a harder time recovering, so non-failure training may be generally preferable. Finally, if your outside lifestyle isn't conducive to optimize recovery, perhaps you're under a lot of stress, sleeping poorly, or cutting, non-failure training may be the best option in these conditions. Are there any practical methods you can use to detect if CNS fatigue is present? Some say measuring your hand grip strength can do this, but at least 2 studies find hand grip strength fails to correlate with CNS fatigue, perhaps because the muscles of the hands are too small to be sensitive to CNS fatigue. Measuring your performance on explosive movements, such as a vertical jump, might be better. Why? Remember, CNS fatigue involves reduced muscle fiber recruitment, and this will largely be a reduction in fast twitch muscle fiber recruitment. Since explosive movements are mainly powered by those fast twitch fibers, a reduction in performance on these could reflect the presence of CNS fatigue. As far as I know, no studies have properly assessed this. The closest thing I could find is this study, finding after a workout, the reduction in vertical jump height did correlate with a reduction in back squat performance, but not with other exercises. The correlations were based on data between different people, so future research is required to more precisely answer the question of whether for a given person, if a greater vertical jump height reduction strongly correlates with CNS fatigue and the performance loss on various exercises. What about your own feelings about how fatigued you are? To my knowledge, there's no data looking at the association between subjective fatigue and CNS fatigue, but with overall fatigue, it might actually be a decent indicator. One study finds after lifting weights, a strong correlation between how subjectively fatigued they felt and their squat performance. Another one finds subjective fatigue has some correlation to the extent of muscle damage. Yet, there are some other papers finding poorer associations between subjective fatigue and lifting performance. So summarizing this section, hand grip strength isn't strongly informative of CNS fatigue, explosive movements could better infer CNS fatigue, and subjective perception may not be a terrible indicator of overall neuromuscular fatigue. But an interesting question is, do you even need to worry about measuring fatigue or laboriously considering it? There's nothing wrong with tracking and being analytical about fatigue if you desire, but I don't believe it's essential. Many people have made tremendous gains without meticulously tracking fatigue. At the end of the day, you'll know if you're consistently running into recovery problems through performance stagnation, regression, and perhaps unforeseen subjective feelings. Adjustments can then be made off of this. Also, as hinted throughout, recovery tends to quicken as you accustom yourself to a training program, thanks to a range of adaptations your body produces called the repeated bout effect. At the House of Hypertrophy, we've previously seen this fascinating study out of Greece that had untrained subjects train their quads with maximal eccentric only contractions on a specialized piece of equipment for 5 sets of 15 repetitions, once a week for 10 weeks. Maximal eccentric contractions evoke substantial fatigue and damage. The data demonstrates this. After the training in week 1, substantial damage, soreness, stiffness, and strength loss occurred for at least 5 days after the session. However, as the weeks progressed, the magnitude of damage, soreness, stiffness, and strength loss after training progressively reduced. By the 10th week, virtually full strength recovery occurred within a day or two. Thus, fatigue, likely including CNS fatigue, can be reduced. Having said all this, some people have suggested that trained individuals do not see lower CNS fatigue, based on this study, which is one of the papers mentioned near the start of the video. These researchers had young trained men, middle-aged trained men, and middle-aged untrained men perform 10 sets of 10 reps on the barbell back squat with a 60% 1 rep max load. For all subjects, CNS fatigue was present in the days after. If we focus on the middle-aged subjects, we can see the magnitude of CNS fatigue was fairly similar between both the trained and untrained subjects. Therefore, some have used this as evidence that trained individuals do not experience faster CNS recovery. However, a key consideration of this study is somehow the untrained middle-aged men were pretty strong. Their back squat strength wasn't far off the trained middle-aged men, and their fat-free mass was actually greater. Moreover, remember all subjects performed 10 sets of 10 on the back squat, and chances are the trained individuals were not consistently training with this program, so being unaccustomed to the training probably highly contributed to CNS fatigue. Indeed, we have research indicating after a second workout, some measures of CNS fatigue recover faster. On top of this, recall the study from Greece observed fatigue lasting for numerous days initially. They didn't measure CNS fatigue directly, but we've had previous studies finding CNS fatigue can persist onwards of 3 days after maximal eccentric training. Thus, since the Greek study found subjects were virtually fully recovered within a day or two by the end of the study, logically a reduction in CNS fatigue is in play here too. Also, recall earlier we saw that 2 specific studies failed to find CNS fatigue in the days after training. The subjects of these studies were quite trained, and I think this probably played an important part in the results. Finally, there's this fascinating study that recruited 13 trained men, with these averaged 10 rep max strength levels and FFMI. They trained this program every day for 4 days. Each set was performed with repetitions up to a 9 to 9.5 RPE, meaning they would have been stopping around 1 rep short of failure. They were performing 4 hard sets for the chest and 4 hard sets for the quads each session. Across the 4 days, bench press performance remained the same. The same applied to back squats. Therefore, these trained individuals were essentially recovering their performance within 24 hours between sessions. The point isn't that you should do this precise training, rather it's to demonstrate the recovery capacity that's possible to develop. Now, it's worth mentioning individual differences do exist. Returning to the Greek study, the researchers provided the individual data. Virtually all individuals aligned with the average results. seeing much less fatigue from training across the 10 weeks. Yet there were seemingly around 2 to 4 individuals who, although saw improvements across the 10 weeks, still experienced fairly notable fatigue after training in the 10th week. Thus, some individuals failed to develop the repeated bout effect as well as others. Another potentially interesting point is that if we return to the paper which had subjects train this program daily for 4 days, the researchers noted the strongest individuals, whose bench press 10 rep max was 1.25 times their body weight, failed to replicate their performance from the first day, suggesting their recovery was slightly worse. This may point towards the notion that there's a threshold of strength level where if you pass it, it does make recovery harder from training. I'll be curious to see if future research corroborates this. Even so, I think for the most part, we can say recovery largely improves as you accustom yourself to a training program. If you're searching for additional ideas about programming for muscle hypertrophy, the Alpha Progression app can help. It has an exceptionally flexible custom workout generator that uses training variables based on meta-analyses and reviews from the scientific literature. Specify your training experience, the equipment you have, and how often and how long you want to train for. You can still individualize things further by editing things to your preference. The app also provides neat graphs displaying your long-term progression, and there's a database of 550 exercises. The link in the comments and description allows you to try everything on the app entirely for free for 2 weeks. And if you like it and go beyond, the link gives you 20% off a subscription. We don't just partner with anyone at the House of Hypertrophy, so rest assured the app is great. Let us recap the main points. CNS fatigue refers to a reduced electrical drive from the CNS, the brain and spinal cord, to the muscle, resulting in reduced muscle force production. Interestingly, some studies have failed to observe CNS fatigue in the days after lifting, yet other studies have found it, and unsurprisingly, higher volumes, that's more sets per exercise per session, seems to produce greater CNS fatigue. Contrary to popular belief, lighter loads, and thus higher reps, actually appear to produce greater CNS fatigue, both within the training session and the ensuing hours, compared to heavier loads, and thus lower reps. The majority of the current evidence fails to support the notion that deadlift is more fatiguing compared to other exercises, but more research is needed to more confidently draw conclusions. Of course, training to failure produces overall more fatigue compared to not training to failure, but preliminary data indicates this greater overall fatigue may not be due to greater CNS fatigue, rather muscle damage. Insofar as tracking CNS fatigue, hand grip strength doesn't appear to be a valid indicator. My speculation is that explosive movements, such as vertical jump performance, may be a better indicator of CNS fatigue, but I don't think it's essential to be overly meticulous about tracking fatigue. If you ever run into recovery problems, it should become apparent in one way or another: performance stagnation, regression, and/or subjective perception. Your recovery durations tend to become faster as you accustom yourself to a training program. This likely involves lower CNS fatigue. How can we effectively develop the side delts? Feel free to check out our video on the topic.